Ever since the first organised groups appeared on Habbo Hotel, a Club Penguin-style game for teenagers and young adults, there existed a desire to destroy one's competition. In the old-school Habbo of the 2000s, groups role-playing as gangs, militaries and mafias fought wars against one another to settle the ultimate question of who reigned supreme. They sent moles to infiltrate one another, trashed each other's headquarters, and conducted flashy coordinated raids that were publicised in promotional ads. But by the early 2010s, a new type of group had emerged, one that cared very little about fighting wars for prestige alone: the Habbo Corporation, known as an agency in-game. For these agencies, only one thing mattered: making virtual money and making lots of it. In a cutthroat capitalistic world where credits, Habbo's virtual currency, were revered as God, the only thing valued more than social capital was actual capital. By 2019, directors of agencies with annual turnovers as high as $20,000 were cashing out their credits for US dollars on the black market. The differing motivations of these agencies didn't make them pacifists, however, because the mere existence of rivals in such a hyper-competitive environment posed existential risks to their bottom line. Unlike businesses in other worlds, which made money by selling goods and services to consumers, these agencies made money by selling stuff to their own employees. Specifically, they made money by selling to their workers positions of power. The power to order around subordinates, the power to promote and demote, the power to play God. The issue is that power only sells if there are enough people to exercise it on, and agencies with a lead in numbers can very quickly snowball in growth, encouraging those in smaller outlets to defect to their larger rivals. So, if a group is falling behind in recruitment numbers, what can they do? They have three options: succumb to their fate and die, innovate and stand out, or go on the offensive and eliminate their competition. But this wasn't old school Habbo anymore. The playing field had drastically changed. Compared to the militaries of old, the new school agencies had far greater access to money, people, and expertise, and they were prepared to throw the kitchen sink to protect their hard-won profits. They tightened internal security procedures, drafted contingency plans, and set up counterintelligence teams to root out potential traitors. With access to capital, they opened up the spending taps on training programs, security tools, and backup bases to ensure continuity of operations. The rise of agencies in the 2010s marked a watershed moment within Habbo's private sector. With the playbook on old-school warfare failing to deliver the shock and awe it once did in the noughties, groups had little choice but to adapt. Corporate espionage among agencies, militaries and mafias became vogue as hot wars transformed into cold ones. The transition to the new school Habbo brought radical change to other parts of the game as well. In particular, the advent of Wired, the redstone of Habbo, in late 2010 allowed players to create automated contraptions for the very first time, virtually changing how the game was played overnight. Players were soon ramming Wired into everything they touched, from privatised bread queues to postmodern art exhibitions, and it didn't take long for agencies to begin using the technology in their headquarters. But as researchers began digging further into the potential use cases of the technology, some came to a crucial realization. The same technology that can make doors open upon flicking a switch, the same technology that can make users teleport upon sitting on a chair, is the same technology that can blow up entire rooms upon uttering a secret phrase. The theory was there. Weapons of mass destruction could be used against enemy agencies to destroy them financially, operationally, and psychologically. The only barrier left to corporate nuclear proliferation was building them in practice. As a massively multiplayer sandbox game, Habbo Hotel allows players to create rooms. If a player wanted to have things in those rooms, like furniture, they had to buy those using Habbo's virtual currency, credits, which could only be obtained with real-life money. Thus, from the very beginning of the game's history, the player base was split between the haves and the have-nots. For the haves, the only thing limiting them was their own creativity, and soon enough, players were setting up shops, auction houses, casinos, games, and roleplays. One of these roleplays revolved around the creation of organised groups, which fashioned themselves as gangs, police, mafias, and militaries. These groups, which I'll collectively refer to as militaries, hung out in a room created by their owners, which served as their headquarters. The militaries of old-school Habbo had simple but strict hierarchies. When a new player joined a Habbo military, they would start as a recruit at the very bottom. They'd be given basic training where they were taught the basics of the organisation, such as what rules they had to follow, what uniform they had to wear, and what things they had to do. During training, they'd also be imparted with the most important rule: always obey commands issued by a superior officer. After working for some time, a recruit would be given their first significant promotion, Sentry, where they'd be tasked with guarding the entrance to the base. If an outsider tried to enter the base, the sentry would keep them out. If someone wasn't wearing the proper uniform, the sentry would order them to get changed. If someone was a member and followed all relevant military rules, the sentry would let them in. The role of sentry would often be the first time a member of a military would get a taste of power. The power was illusory, of course. Sentries had no discretion on who to let in or who to keep out, as they had strict procedures to follow. Nevertheless, this tiny morsel of power was often enough to incentivize members to keep going to reach the next significant rung of the hierarchy: commissioned officer. Commissioned officers were given a significant and coveted power: the power to issue commands. They could tell subordinates to FTF, fill the front, which ordered them to work at the front desk to recruit more members. They could tell subordinates to FTS, fill the sentry, which ordered them to go on sentry duty. They could even tell subordinates to ATT, call to attention, which ordered them to stop what they were doing, stand in front of the commanding officer, wave with their avatar, and shout, "Yes sir, ma'am, Private Trollgark reporting as ordered." Then the subordinate would just stand there and do nothing else, while the commissioned officer would be free to give their whole spiel, for example to promote or demote the subordinate, which could last anywhere between 10 seconds to 10 minutes, before being allowed to return to their workstation upon being given another command, AE, at ease. Finally, near the top, there were the general officers, the bigwigs of the military, the ones with the actual power. They could exempt themselves from the military regulations they wrote, they could promote, discipline, or sack anybody they wanted without question, and they could declare war and peace against other organised groups. And at the top were the owners, the very people who founded the group in the first place. Habbo isn't a PvP game. You can't exactly kill other Habbos. So what were these gangs, militaries, and mafias actually doing then? Broadly speaking, they did three things. Firstly, as mentioned before, they did roleplay. Many Habbo militaries attempted to emulate their real-world counterparts in terms of ranks, uniforms, and procedures. Some even held military parades where they invited the general public to watch while their soldiers performed drills. Secondly, these groups did recruitment. As many of these militaries aspired to be the best, whatever that meant, many of them were locked into fierce rivalries on who could muster the largest army. Over time, owners began offering pay to members as a way to incentivize new players to join. As these military groups often didn't earn any money in the first place, this pay often came out of the pockets of the owners or other wealthy donors. Military groups at the time also began recruiting players who were already members of a rival organisation, offering equivalent or higher ranks as an incentive. This practice of poaching or transferring members from rival groups often caused a great deal of consternation among militaries, and sometimes became a casus belli for war. This brings us on to the third thing that these groups did: raiding, which is when an organised group of players descend onto an enemy base and start spamming the hell out of it. The raiders disrupted the enemy's operations and halted all ordinary business until they were banned from the room. So why did the gangs, militaries, and mafias raid other groups? Well, for one, a lot of them were 13-year-old kids, and raids were seen as both very cool and very fun. Military groups sometimes uploaded their exploits on YouTube as an advertising tool, both to attract new players but also to attract potential defectors working for rival militaries. Over time, warfare between Habbo militaries became more sophisticated. Groups began forming alliances with each other, leading to even larger raids by coalition forces and full-on rivalries between military blocs. Commando forces were set up to conduct more ambitious operations, such as turning invisible to sneak into an enemy's base and block its entrance, a technique that was a closely guarded secret at the time. Some groups even began sending spies to conduct recon missions on rivals, for example to study when an enemy's high-ranking officials were offline to maximize the chances of a successful raid. Some even went so far as to study and copy the military uniforms of their enemies to open up the possibility of conducting false flag attacks. Eventually, these simple recon missions morphed into full-on espionage operations, where gangs, militaries, and mafias sent moles to infiltrate their enemies. The goal of these operations were very simple: to climb the enemy's hierarchy as quickly as possible to obtain what was known as room rights. Room rights were special permissions that a room owner can give, which allows a player to kick out other players. The distribution of these rights was thus very important for the normal functioning of a military base, as they were the only ones that could kick out any raiders. However, room rights also allowed players to do another thing: place and move furniture around. This meant that a mole that obtained room rights could grief the enemy's base in an act known as trashing. Soon, militaries were perfecting the art of combined offensives, trashing and raiding an enemy simultaneously. Multiple moles with room rights could sow absolute chaos and confusion within the enemy's ranks, as they could trash the base multiple times in quick succession, forcing them to go into lockdown as they frantically tried to root out the traitors hiding among them. By the time the 2010s rolled around, it appeared that the Habbo militaries had learned everything they needed to know about warfare, having had a decade of experience raiding, trashing, and spying against one another. But all of that was about to change when a new type of group began to emerge, one that possessed a radically different mindset to the militaries of old: the Habbo Agency. At a glance, the agencies of New School Habbo had a lot in common with their old school counterparts. They both had linear hierarchical structures, they both placed heavy emphasis on recruitment, and they both used the same commands, for example FTF, FTS, and ATT. But there was one major difference that set apart the old school militaries from the new school agencies. While the old school owners saw their groups as a form of roleplay, the new school owners saw their agencies as a form of business, as another way to make money. At this point in 2010, Habbo had gone through a whirlwind of changes that had radically transformed the game. The player base had exploded after the 5 English-speaking servers, US, Canada, UK, Australia, and Singapore, all merged into one mega server. Room sizes were getting bigger, subscription costs were getting more costly, and new wide contraptions were taking the game by storm. By seeing their agencies through the cold lens of a balance sheet, the agency owners saw a need to innovate their companies to change with the times, and change they did, taking drastic steps to decrease expenses and increase revenues. For the former, owners began ditching roleplay and raiding aspects that were present in old school militaries. These activities, after all, generated no revenue for the agency, and every minute spent on the parade grounds playing pretend soldier is time not spent earning the owners money. Instead, the agencies would focus on doing one thing: recruitment, and they were going to do everything they could to attract new players to join. They built massive, spacious, semi-automated bases that could remain operational with fewer employees. They hiked worker salaries and heavily advertised their agency's higher pay. Of course, these shiny new bases and salaries weren't going to pay for themselves, and so the agency owners did something that would have been completely unthinkable on old school Habbo. They openly sold ranks for credits. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that there wasn't corruption in old school Habbo, where players would seemingly get large promotions after making a sizable donation to their military or police force, But what I am saying is that this practice was widely seen as just that: corruption, a misuse of power for private gain. Habbo's corporate world had broken a taboo. What was once seen as a morally objectionable practice was now seen as a perfectly legitimate business model. For the business model to work though, employees would have to be incentivized to purchase promotions. In the old school militaries, members who had consistently demonstrated loyalty and hard work had the potential to reach the top. That's a model that the new school agencies couldn't adopt, because the people who were most likely to pay for promotions were also the ones who were most likely to be hardworking and loyal in the first place. Consequently, agency owners had to invent a new type of corporate ladder, one that would be much more capable of incentivizing people, particularly those who were the most loyal and hardworking, to pay for promotions. To see what they came up with and to understand how they became so effective in getting people to pay, let's delve into the corporate ladder of one specific agency, the Habbo FBI. When a recruit finishes training in the Habbo FBI, they're promoted to the role of Cadet Second Class and are sent off to work at the front desk to recruit new players. After just 10 minutes of work, according to the Habbo FBI's company policy, they're eligible for promotion to Cadet First Class. 10 minutes after that, the player is eligible to be promoted to Attendant, and then Guard, and then Officer, then Agent, Community Service Officer, Constable, Intelligent Helper, Custody Assistant, Bum Inspector, and finally Detective. With less than 2 hours of work, a new employee would have gone through a whirlwind of promotions, and not long after, they'd be given their first significant promotion, Security Officer 3, the equivalent of a sentry in old school militaries. At the Security Division, an employee is eligible for a promotion every 15 minutes, and after 2.5 hours, they'd reach the next division, the Training Division, where they'd be tasked with training new recruits. After 3 hours, they'd reach the Special Operations Division, where they're tasked with advertising the agency, and another 4.5 hours later, they're given the coveted role of High Rank. High ranks, commonly known as HR, are roughly analogous to commissioned officers in old school militaries. They can issue commands to subordinates to give out promotions and demotions, or just flat out sack them. At this point, the newly appointed HR, with their vast array of powers and privileges, would have had at least 13 hours of work experience, something that could be achieved in about a week or two in the agency. But this is when the pace of promotions begins to slow down. Now, an employee is eligible for a promotion every half an hour, although in practice it's likely to take much longer. After at least 9 hours of cycling through job titles that have nothing to do with their actual job, including Forensic Examiner, Secretary of Internal Affairs, Secretary of National Defense, Secretary of Public Safety, Secretary Manager, and Specialist Manager, they reach the next division, Senior High Rank. Senior HR is the first middle management role that an employee would have, and this is the innovation that the new school agencies came up with. Middle managers sit between the HRs and the top executives, commonly referred to as the ICs, meaning those in command. Middle managers get no new powers or privileges. The only thing the middle managers get is the ability to command, promote, and demote those low ranked than them. In the case of the Habbo FBI, senior HRs get no new powers except the ability to promote HRs, and in return for this power, they have to wait 45 minutes to be eligible for each promotion. After over 14 hours of cycling through even more meaningless titles, where the title of Junior High Rank outranks High Rank Administrator, try figuring that one out, they reach the Judicial Department, the second middle management division. Judicial Department members get no new powers except the power to promote senior HRs, and after an additional 10 hours, they reach the Professional Staff Division. Company policy dictates that promotion to this division requires training, but don't be fooled. Professional staff don't get new powers other than the power to promote those below them. They need training because professional staff get a new job being glorified customer service and an agency's help desk. Professional staff is the third middle management division, and after 22 hours they reach the Tactician Unit. After another 20 hours they reach the Special Detective Unit, and after another 42 hours they reach the Consultant Team. At this point, many employees would feel like they're stuck in some sort of rut. They've poured at least 90 hours into an agency, very likely a lot more than that, and all they have to show for it is a badge showing that they're at their 6th middle management division. Every single badge they collect only feels like it's making promotion even more of a grind, and to reach the next middle management division, criminal justice, an employee would have to pour in another 36 hours, and then another 36 hours to reach the board of managers, and then another 55 to reach the senior leadership council, and then another 96 to reach human resources, and then 98 for general counsel, 96 for presidential, 126 for office of administration, 156 for management, which by the way includes ridiculous job titles like office of issue special treatment, economic balance reviewer, and problems highlighter, before finally putting another 408 hours to achieve ambassador, the lowest possible IC position. For an employee to go from HR to the lowest IC rank, the Habbo FBI, per their company policy, expects an employee to be in the agency for over 1,100 hours, or over 45 days non-stop. But we're not even done, because Ambassador is the lowest IC rank. If an employee wanted to reach a position roughly analogous to the general staff in an old school military, where they had actual power with some sort of financial stake in the company, they'd have to go through an entire division, the Directorate, where they'd have to cycle through even more job titles before finally reaching that division, Office of Professional Responsibility. When the Canadian military posted an ad on YouTube in May 2007, it advertised the fact that it offered pay to its workers once a week. It also showed that a recruit could attain a position within the general staff with just 28 promotions. 17 years later, the Habbo FBI is offering employees pay at least 3 times a day, and is offering bonuses to anyone who logs into the agency with an alt account to artificially inflate the room's population numbers. In return, recruits are given the opportunity to attain a similar position with just 252 promotions. And the Habbo FBI isn't the only one. Many agencies across Habbo do the exact same thing. The corporate world of Habbo had hijacked the non-profit military roleplay of old school Habbo and had replaced it with a soulless pay-to-win bureaucracy. With disenchanted middle managers foregoing pay to get more promotions and forking over hundreds of US dollars worth of credits to reach the top, agencies began raking in the money. As disclosed in a previous video, these rank sales helped one agency in 2019 achieve an estimated annual turnover of 300,000 credits, or 20,000 US dollars at black market rates. The ensuing backlash against the new conglomerates was inevitable. The agencies posed an existential threat to the old school militaries, as they poached their members with promises of higher pay, higher positions of authority, and a substantially larger workforce that they could boss around. Initially, the old school groups did what they had always done: raid the bases of these agencies. But this wasn't old school Habbo anymore. The agencies had the money, the people, and the technology to fight back. The playbook on old school warfare had been ripped apart as Habbo entered into a new era. The hot wars were out and the cold wars were in. Corporate espionage was the new flash. To understand why corporate espionage became vogue by the mid-2010s, we must first understand why old-school warfare fell out of fashion during the same period. As mentioned before, early military strategy focused on direct attacks on an enemy's headquarters using 2 complementary tactics: raiding and trashing. Raiding became far less effective when Habbo introduced several key features giving room owners greater control. Owners could adjust automod settings to censor whatever words they wanted, change the distance at which other Habbos could be heard, and automatically mute people if they spammed too many messages. The introduction of a setting allowing avatars to walk through one another killed the ability for raiders to physically block entrances to bases. Agencies and militaries also began investing in training programs to teach members how to respond to raids when they happened. While lower-ranked members were taught to simply ignore the raiders and continue like nothing was going on, higher-ranked members were taught riot control techniques to contain the raids. For example, during the January 2021 Quackity raid, which saw rooms and agency headquarters inundated with raiders protesting the Habbo 2020 tax changes, a military called the USDF employed a tactic known as kettling, confining a large group of players into a small, controlled area. This area, comprised of the elevated platform and staircase, was covered by wire which prevented most players from talking. The only way to exit the area was to go through a narrow corridor with a set of one-way gates, preventing the uncontrolled spillover of raiders you see happening in other rooms, and allowing officials to quickly kick or ban any raiders attempting to break themselves in. By the mid-2010s, agencies had also drastically improved internal security. Old-school militaries in the noughties were particularly vulnerable to infiltrators pretending to be one of them. As mentioned before, some militaries capitalized on this by copying the uniforms of their enemies, one of the few methods available for identification to conduct infiltration raids or false flag attacks. An early attempt to solve this problem was the use of security questions, whereby members would only be let into the base if they correctly answered a question given by a sentry. For example, members could be asked to give the name of the officer who last promoted them. Eventually, agencies and militaries began making greater use of out-of-platform communications, including forums and custom websites. Sentries were able to check the credentials of anyone trying to get in by simply typing a player's name into an external database. The decline of raids, both in impact and frequency, also had consequences for the other old-school military tactic, trashing. As many militaries and agencies gave room rights to ensure the security of their headquarters, the decline in raids meant there was less need to give out room rights so broadly. Consequently, many began minimizing the number of rights holders they had, reducing their likelihood of getting trashed. Any moles that had a goal of obtaining room rights now had to contend with the reality that their operations weren't going to take days or weeks, but months on end. And unlike in the old school militaries, where they'd have a dozen or so ranks to climb before they obtained those rights, the new school agencies were going to make them climb a rigged corporate ladder with hundreds of ranks that were designed to be paid to win. So agencies, militaries, and mafias had to develop new methods of tradecraft. Luckily for them, paying was only one of several ways a player could quickly climb the corporate ladder. A different way of climbing the corporate ladder was to parachute oneself to an already high-ranking position. Moles could do this by getting a transfer, which is when a member of one agency is given a job offer to join another in return for getting a roughly equivalent rank in the other agency. Groups parachuted moles into enemy agencies who transferred under false pretenses, and some moles transferred through multiple agencies to make it harder for counterintelligence to trace their original employer. Agencies and other groups could even create shell companies with fake websites, fake badges, and fake ranks, with the sole purpose of facilitating transfers to enemy agencies. Once they parachuted themselves in, moles could climb the corporate ladder as quickly as possible by seeking leapfrog promotions that allow a member to jump several ranks. Leapfrogs are often given by top-ranking officials, such as the agency owners, and so moles would often use their social engineering skills to curry favour with the owners. The mafias, in particular, became incredibly adept at social engineering. In an interview given in 2021, a source within the Velour Mafia, a group considered a terrorist organisation by multiple agencies and militaries within Habbo, disclosed how they carried out a practice known as agency racketeering. Working in groups of up to 4, its moles were instructed to befriend as many agency workers as they could by participating in social functions. They obtained the personal details of agency employees, such as their names, home addresses, and photos, and handed them over to their handlers. The handlers would then anonymously contact the employees and threaten to dox them or release compromat unless they did as they were told, which could include handing over access to their Habbo accounts, giving promotions to specific individuals, or providing personal information about other employees. According to another source familiar with a different mafia, members intentionally targeted highly vulnerable individuals, often with disabilities, to maximize the chances of a successful extortion. The racketeering of several agencies by the Habbo Mafia, which allegedly forced some to close their doors, led to the passage of the CIWT, the Condemnation of Illegal Warfare Treaty, Habbo's equivalent of the Geneva Convention. The CIWT prohibited any group or person from conducting, threatening, or hinting at any form of hacking, DDoSing, doxing, and public release of personal information, and mandated that its signatories ban anyone who violated its provisions. But what exactly were moles meant to do even if they did obtain room rights? The détente between agencies and militaries meant no one was particularly keen on being seen as the aggressors, or more specifically, anyone who cared about adhering to Habbo international law. While trashing immediately upon receiving room rights was a no-no, both because of the aforementioned diplomacy reason, but also because that would immediately out the identity of the mole, groups still wanted to be prepared, just in case. There was always a potential for the Habbo Cold War to turn hot, particularly as high-profile diplomatic spats were fairly common. Some pondered a particular solution. Why not build weapons of mass destruction? At their most basic form, wired are pieces of furniture that can be stacked together to create automated or semi-automated contraptions. There are the triggers, the brown boxes, which represent certain types of input, for example when a user enters the room or when a specific keyword is set. There are the effects, the grey boxes, which represent certain types of outputs, such as making a user teleport or making a door open. And there are the conditions, the white and black boxes, which allow the specification of conditions, such as only allowing an effect to trigger if a lamp is switched on, or if someone isn't standing on a tile. The introduction of wired was nothing short of revolutionary, and it further solidified the divide between old school and new school Habbo. As quickly as players began finding positive use cases for wired, such as the construction of automated games, players began using it in more unscrupulous ways, such as the creation of underground casinos to circumvent the game's gambling ban, or, in my case, creating entirely rigged games. It didn't take long for some players to realise that wired didn't just have constructive potential, it also had destructive ones as well. The first generation of wired nukes were crude in their construction, using the effect Move and Rotate Fernie, which allowed a wired contraption to, move and rotate pieces of furniture in a room, and combining it with a trigger Repeat effect, which allowed an effect to be triggered every half a second, players were able to automatically trash a room. All it took was for a player to spam those Move and Rotate effects for the contraption to turn into a nuke. You can modify the nuke so that it only detonates upon someone uttering a specific keyword to create a covert weapon of mass destruction. Now, instead of having a mole sitting around and doing nothing, a mole can make themselves useful by planting a nuke inside the enemy's headquarters. They can hide the nuke behind a false wall, inside a block, or up in the sky. Whenever the go-ahead is given, an alt account can be sent over to remotely detonate the nuke by saying a couple of magic words. The potential for these weapons was obvious. Moles no longer needed to operate indefinitely, as all they had to do was plant a nuke inside the enemy's headquarters for an agency to retain their trashing capabilities. An agency could even create a full-on nuclear umbrella by dispatching moles to every agency and military, both friend and foe, to covertly plant nuclear weapons in their headquarters, just in case. And these wired weapons were ferocious. Upon detonation, the contraption would move and rotate furniture every half a second. The longer the weapon had been set off, the more damage it did, and banning the person who had triggered the weapon in the first place did nothing to stop the nuke from perpetually destroying the room. The only way for a room owner to begin reconstruction would be to defuse the nuke in the first place, and if the nuke was very well hidden, well, good luck with that. But as researchers began looking further into the viability of wired nukes, more and more problems began to emerge. For one, first generation wired nukes in 2010 didn't look like this, but instead looked more like this. And where exactly were you meant to hide that? The massive footprint of these nukes also led to another problem. If nuclear proliferation ever became commonplace in corporate warfare, agency counterintelligence teams would very quickly learn to conduct bug sweeps. This is when a player uses the command Fernie to see a list of all of the furniture inside a room. Move and rotate Fernie effects weren't exactly a normal thing to find in an agency or military headquarters, and certainly not one in massive quantities. To make matters worse, the wired nuke left behind a ton of highly incriminating evidence. If you click on a piece of furniture in the game, it displays the owner of that furniture. So if a mole installed a wired nuke in an enemy's headquarters, it would literally have their name all over it. At that point, you might as well dress up as all purple, go invisible, and trash the old school way, because at least with that method, you're not leaving behind forensic evidence all over the crime scene. But what ultimately doomed the first generation wide nukes was their sheer cost. Each move and rotate effect cost 4 credits, meaning you'd be quickly racking up a bill of hundreds if not thousands of credits to build something that was remotely explosive. Their expense made them nothing more than Wunderwaffen, a weapon so commercially unviable and fantastical that it would never see the light of day. No agency in their right mind would ever think about using a wide nuke. Actually, they dropped 2. Financial cost was a barrier for agencies that operated on Habbo Hotel. The same couldn't be said for agencies that operated on other servers. Habbo Retros are illegal knockoffs of Habbo, and now, because I've made the mistake of even mentioning the term Habbo Retros, I'll now make the following statement out of my own free will. This is not an endorsement of Habbo Retros, many of whom violate Solarke's intellectual property rights, no matter how much they insist in their disclaimers at the bottom of their website that their retro is for non-profit educational purposes only. The primary reason why players play on retros is that, unlike Habbo itself, retros offer free credits to players for simply being online, essentially providing a form of universal basic income. This didn't make them socialist utopias, however. Their economies were still very much capitalist, albeit with serious inflation issues. What retros did do was allow ordinary players to do something that was previously gated to an elite group of players: the ability to build in a multiplayer sandbox game. In the context of the private sector, this meant 2 things. Firstly, the largest barrier to creativity and innovation, cost, had come shattering down. Agencies, militaries, and other organised groups with access to large volumes of capital were able to experiment in a way that their Habbo counterparts simply couldn't do. Secondly, any player who wanted to start an agency had the money to do so, meaning that retros were soon packed to the brim with agencies and militaries of their own. Perhaps there's no better illustration of the disillusionment some players had with the retro corporate world than a player called The Quen, who, in the course of keeping a video diary of the things she did in her retro, made illuminating videos titled Habboon Getting Shitty Job and Habboon First 15 Minutes of Work. In the latter video, she started off screaming, "This fucking shit job driving me crazy, fuck you all, fuck your mums," and then proceeded to drive a car straight through her manager before stripping off entirely naked. By the mid-2010s, nuclear proliferation was all the rage among agencies in the largest retros. The fact that practically anyone could just build an agency meant that information asymmetry was rampant among agency owners. Unlike their Habbo counterparts, many were simply not as guarded or vigilant in giving out room rights to people, leading to situations like in this video, where a complete stranger asked for and received room rights in the span of 2 minutes, leading to a very short trashing video. In one particular retro, Habboon, agencies were embroiled in a full-scale war against one another. The Boon CIA notoriously conducted a string of attacks against agencies using wide nukes, likely by posing as innocent building contractors to covertly install them in their bases without their knowledge. It subsequently uploaded the videos on YouTube as advertising material, spamming their logo and bonfires on the wreckage of their enemies for good measure. The increasing spate of attacks and counterattacks, including raids, trashings, and nukings, sparked widespread alarm among agency owners, who convened emergency meetings to discuss collective responses. Agencies began pouring millions of credits into espionage and counterintelligence programs. The NSA, for example, publicly announced it was paying 250,000 credits to every undercover agent that was operating in the IPD, one of their enemies. Mid-2010 Habboon provided a window to a parallel world. While the Habbo corporate world began its era of detente, the retro corporate world was nuking each other into smithereens. There were indications at the time that the retro was descending into an arms race. Agencies were willing to pay top dollar to hire what few wide experts there were to help them with certain things, such as wiring up base defenses. It was this environment that made one specific agency, the Roman Empire, increasingly paranoid. It had already made several enemies at this point, such as the UK government, which refused to stop poaching its members, and the FBI, which sent trashing threats. But if that wasn't enough, it was also receiving intelligence reports that other agencies such as the CIA, which had demonstrated nuclear capabilities, and Interboon, which had an awful name, were attacking other agencies indiscriminately. In response, the Roman Empire began diverting its resources to a wide R&D program to research ways wide could be used to defend itself. If it was able to create an advanced automated base defense system, kind of like the Iron Dome, the Empire would be able to repel any raids or trashing attempts by its adversaries. It could even export that technology, or at least a light version of it, to its friends and allies as a way to gain diplomatic favour. If you're wondering how I know all of this, it's because I was the one that started the R&D program. I was the one who founded the Roman Empire, the one who sat through those boring interagency meetings, and the one to receive intelligence briefings from my network of totally not spy diplomats. And as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. The best defense against trashing and nukings is to not give out room rights at all. Without room rights, players can't mess with the room. So I set about creating a base that would negate any need to give out room rights by automating it as far as 2016-wide technology would allow. Most agency bases only had one security checkpoint, FTS, which players only went through once they were let in by front desk staff. My base had a second security checkpoint, the anti-raid checkpoint, which was hidden behind this tent. How it worked was that the base kept track of the rate of people entering the room. If too many people entered the room within a short period of time, it indicated that there was a possibility of a raid. When that happened, the anti-raid procedures automatically kicked in, and any new entrants would be subjected to further checks by the second checkpoint before being allowed to enter the public area of the HQ. The fact that the checkpoint was hidden inside a tent was significant, as the tent only allowed those inside it to see each other's speech. If there were any raiders caught by the anti-raid that was spamming their lungs out, the entire base wouldn't even know about it. For any raiders that slipped past the anti-raid and somehow managed to enter the public area, a high-ranking member could use several commands. One of these commands allowed for the eviction of everyone in the public area, which booted them back into the anti-raid tent. If the base was substantially compromised and the raiders managed to finesse their way in, high-ranking members could also evict players in certain sections of the base, which I had intentionally compartmentalized. If there were no high-ranking officials present and the base was only staffed by lower-ranked members, the base was also outfitted with an emergency panic button. If a recruit or security officer used the command 999, an announcement would blare out in the HQ informing everyone that an emergency had been called. This locked down the entire base and required 2 additional members of the base to confirm the emergency. If the emergency was confirmed, the entire room was booted to the anti-raid tent, whereupon members would be instructed to wait for a high-ranking official to resolve the emergency. With all of these tools, however, came an obvious downside. If these commands were misused, such as the 999 command, they could cause substantial disruption. But this was a calculated trade-off. In return for giving subordinates the proper tools to fight back against raids, which were, yes, very powerful, I didn't have to give out room rights. If anyone abused those commands, I'd just sack them on the spot, and I'd do so with my base still intact. With a flashy new base defense system in place, I began a public relations blitz to wow both prospective allies and members of the Empire. Demonstration tests were held in public, and offers to build a light version entirely for free were given to several agencies. There were some things, of course, that couldn't be shown to the public. A primitive anti-trash system was installed, whereby the room would automatically rebuild itself upon uttering a secret command. This had to be kept top secret, because if a trasher knew about the system, they could simply destroy that wide to prevent it from working. But there were also other things that the public couldn't be told about, like the fact that the base defense system was a complete facade, a way to justify the expenses in the Empire's budget that was spent on R&D. You didn't really think that the wired research program was to create defensive tools, right? The best defense is a good offense, and what I really wanted was a new weapon. The Roman Empire was not my first rodeo in dealing with retro agencies. Before I founded the Empire, I worked as a game designer and real estate agent in a different retro which had a feature where you could buy and sell entire rooms to other players. Apart from selling game rooms that I had built myself, I sold agency headquarters to owners who were willing to fork over millions of credits for good bases. The thing was, while there was a large demand for good agency headquarters in the hotel, there was also a steady supply of them built by players who were far better at building than I was. So what I did instead was I bought pre-built agency headquarters to sell them on for a profit. Except I wasn't very good at my job, and I'm pretty sure I lost money on every single building I sold, in one case writing off the value of a building completely by just giving it as a gift to another agency. And it wasn't like I wasn't trying. I'd give tours to prospective buyers showing off all of the different features, functional and aesthetic, that the base had. But one, I was 14 years old, so I wasn't exactly a good negotiator, and two, I wasn't the only real estate agent in town. Agency owners could just walk away if I couldn't give them a price that they found reasonable. I also sucked at my job for a different reason. Every time I gave a tour to prospective buyers, I always forgot to tell them about a peculiar feature they had. These rooms were bugged to hell. Every single door, every single gate, every single security feature had a back door. Upon command, I could mute the entire room, or, of course, make it explode. I also added a literal backdoor all the way up in the sky, allowing me to enter these rooms whenever I pleased, even when their owners locked the rooms. This was particularly useful for private meeting rooms, which I had generously bundled for free when you bought an agency base with me. In the pre-Discord days when out-of-platform communications were not as widely used, agencies and militaries would host private meetings in-game where they would share top-secret information which I was now privy to as I welcomed myself in with a backdoor. Was I working for a specific agency or group? Nope. I did it because I thought it was funny. I was just doing a little bit of trolling. One of the things I enjoyed doing was framing completely innocent employees who had done nothing to deserve it by messing with their workstations. I'd spam open doors, I'd send people off to the wrong locations after security checks, and I'd make workers stuck on their chairs after being told to stand for attention. Things didn't turn out perfectly, however. I distinctly remember receiving a direct message from a customer once asking, what's this? And finding out that they had discovered one of my back doors. They had entered it, and to my horror, had discovered my secret corridor where I'd hidden all of my other back doors. As luck would have it, I had the foresight to lock all of the other doors, so the player wasn't able to discover what the other doors led to. I also had the foresight to name my corridor of back doors as Test, so I was able to brush it off as me testing something and forgetting to remove the door before I was done. My antics as a rogue realtor had given me an important insight. At least for retro agencies, there were two ways of implanting a wide weapon. One way was to infiltrate them with a mole to obtain room rights. But another way was to use a Trojan horse, to plant one during the construction phase, and then sell that off to an enemy agency. The latter also had a surprise factor. Everybody suspects the rights holders, but nobody ever suspects the real estate agent, or the real estate agent that sold it off to an agency that resold it to another agency. In any case, the delivery method was sorted. All that was left was to create a weapon. When I saw the nuking videos released by the Boone CIA for the first time, I admittedly wasn't very impressed. I thought the operations were done in an incredibly amateurish way. In particular, I was extremely critical of this video, which showed them nuking a base which was still in construction. The Boone CIA could have done way more damage had they just laid low for a while and let base construction finish, and the fact they had made this mistake several times indicated some sort of issue with impatience. I also wasn't impressed because at this point I was becoming far more critical of the wide nuke's potential in general. My biggest gripes with it were twofold. Firstly, they had a large footprint, which could be easily detected by a bug sweep. Secondly, they trashed the room, which of course was the whole point of a wide nuke, but I felt that trashing did very little if any, sustained damage to an agency. Many agencies at this point had backup headquarters, and even if they didn't, trashing would only take out their base for a couple of days. Your only hope would be for an agency owner to rage quit, but that's not remotely guaranteed. So I sought to create a new type of wide weapon, one that could evade basic detection by counterintelligence teams, and one that could do substantial damage to an agency long term. One of the first ideas I toyed with was to use the wide effect Kick User, which did exactly that. Kick a user out of the room. If it was paired with the wide trigger User Enters Room, the contraption effectively became a ban machine. Any user who tried to enter the room would immediately be kicked out. But the device had a major flaw. It couldn't kick out a room owner out of their own room. If the device tried to, the owner would receive a message saying that the wide kick effect had failed to activate, which would inform them of the contraption's existence. After some time experimenting, I began to encounter various bugs. And this is where I should point out something important. While Habbo retros were emulations of Habbo, they weren't exact emulations. One of the more well-known drawbacks many retros had was that their wide was simply not as good as their Habbo counterpart, and thus could produce bugs that wouldn't happen in the main game. So like an intelligence agency hoarding zero-day vulnerabilities, my R&D program began stockpiling various wide glitches I found for potential use. And one of the biggest ones I found at the time revolved around teleporting seats. Using the wide trigger User Walks on Fernie and the effect Teleport to Fernie, you can create a very basic contraption that teleports a user from one seat A to another B. But what happens if you created a second wide stack that made seat B teleport back to seat A? What you end up creating is an infinite teleportation loop. This was already well known at the time, and in fact I had already weaponized it. One of the secret defense features the Empire base had was that it had a secret CIA-style black site. Hidden under this tent was a contraption with the teleporting seat setup, with one crucial modification. It used the wide effect show message to spam the user messages. And by spam, I mean I had put hundreds and hundreds of show message wide effects into the contraption. Every fraction of a second, when a user teleported to a different chair, they would receive another couple hundred spam messages on screen. These messages, being so voluminous, froze the user's game client, but crucially, only their client. Everyone else, being outside observers, was completely unaffected. Instead of banning people from the Empire using the game's inbuilt moderation tools, I had created a wide stack that automatically teleported anyone on a list straight into the black site. Members of the public would be none the wiser because it was being done inside a tent, and anyone stuck in the black site who tried to call for help, assuming their game client didn't immediately break, would have their pleas fall on deaf ears. This setup was too unwieldy to turn into an offensive weapon. It had a gargantuan footprint, meaning it could be easily detected, and the fact that the last thing people saw was a ton of messages gave away important details about how the weapon worked. But let's go back to the original setup with the two seats. What would happen if you stacked the two chairs together? Back when I played the game, it did the same thing. It froze the user's game client. With bug in hand, I began theory crafting the perfect weapon, one capable of delivering a decapitation strike against the enemy. A seat in the enemy's headquarters would be booby-trapped to freeze users that sat on it. Upon activation, enemy leaders would be teleported to the trap, preventing them from entering their own base. With the room owner locked out of their own room, the weapon wouldn't just cause mass confusion, it would cause catastrophic financial damage. Agency bases, chock full of expensive rare items, would be effectively deleted from the game. Like the mafias of Habbo who stole hundreds of thousands of credits from agencies, this weapon was designed to cause bankruptcy. Theory can only take you so far, and the weapon needed to be tested. The issue was that there were no test subjects available, as no formal war had been declared by the Empire. So I hatched a plan. We were going to do a little prank on a friendly agency the Habbo White House. The prank would involve building an exact replica of their base using an alt account. Employees would filter into the fake base thinking that everything was working just as normal. The weapon, when activated, would take out their leadership, preventing a coherent response from materializing. By the time leadership figured out the ruse, the necessary data would have been collected so that I could determine whether the weapon was indeed viable or not. Did it freeze people out of the room? And did it cause mass confusion? For the advocates of nuclear proliferation, the 2010s were a lost decade on Habbo. The prohibitive cost of manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, coupled with the practical difficulties of actually installing them in enemy bases, killed any prospect of a private sector nuclear war on Habbo Hotel. Unburdened by those same constraints, agencies in the retro world leapfrogged their Habbo counterparts in practically every way. Operating under a fierce environment where agencies were getting infiltrated, trashed, and nuked left, right, and centre, the retro corporate world truly embodied the proverb that necessity is the mother of invention. The Roman Empire never got to use its newly developed weapon. It and its adversaries slowly faded away into obscurity as its members, me included, found more productive things to do instead of sitting around at a front desk trying to hire uninterested, unmotivated members of the public. The early 2020s were a rocky start for Habbo, with the whole market crash wiping out over $30 million from the economy thing. The economy and the game did eventually recover though, and soon agencies flooded back the game in droves. Now, you can't even scroll through a list of rooms without seeing them absolutely everywhere. On the 28th of June 2023, Habbo announced it was releasing a new update, Wired 2.0, and it was as consequential as Habbo made it out to be. It introduced a new type of wired, the selector, which essentially allowed a user to compress the number of wide boxes needed to build many contraptions. What once took dozens and dozens of move and rotate effects now only took 2 boxes, one move and rotate effect and one corresponding selector. Overnight, Habbo made the first gen wired nuke completely redundant, because the second gen nukes were made superior in every conceivable way. 10 times as powerful at a fraction of the cost, wide nukes can now be manufactured at a scale completely unimaginable a decade prior. You could even speedrun nuking a room. Now, I'm not saying you should nuke your local agency. What I am saying is that just because the 2010s were a lost decade doesn't mean the 2020s have to be as well.